The contract pages rustled in my hands as I sat at the edge of the leather chair, watching golden lamplight cast long shadows across the mahogany desk. Everything in James L. Garcia's study cost more than my firm would earn in a year. The Persian rug beneath imported Italian furniture. The oil paintings in gilded frames depicting scenes I couldn't afford to visit. The crystal decanters filled with whiskey older than my career. I didn't belong here. My reflection in the dark window behind his desk confirmed it. An architect in a borrowed red velvet dress. Hair styled with drugstore products. Jewelry that would turn my skin green by morning. I'd been fighting for my family's firm for 18 months, invisible to people like him. That's what desperation does. It makes you willing to occupy spaces that could destroy you. The pen grew heavier in my trembling fingers. My heart hammered against ribs constrained by a dress 2 sizes too tight. Borrowed from my sister who'd insisted this meeting could save everything we'd built. The door opened with a whisper of expensive hinges. James L. Garcia entered, 6 feet of controlled violence in a perfectly tailored black suit, dark beard framing lips that had ordered men's deaths, tattooed hands that had signed both business deals and death warrants. His eyes found mine across the suffocating space. Miss Mayo. His voice was velvet over steel. Ready to become my wife? The penthouse elevator climbed 47 floors, each ding marking another step away from the life I'd known. James stood beside me in perfect silence, his presence filling the mirrored space like smoke. The contract in my purse felt heavier than the diamonds now circling my finger, a flawless solitaire that caught the elevator lights and threw fractured rainbows against the walls. Your room is the second door on the left, he said as the doors whispered open to reveal a hallway that belonged in architectural magazines. Italian marble. Crown molding that probably cost more than my annual rent. Mine is at the end. The office is off limits. I nodded, wheeling my single suitcase across floors so pristine they reflected my nervous face back at me. Everything here was cold perfection. Like him. The guest room, my room, was larger than my entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city sprawling below like scattered jewels. The bed could sleep 4 people comfortably. Egyptian cotton sheets. A sitting area with furniture that looked afraid to be touched. The staff will handle your meals, James continued from the doorway, not crossing the threshold. Even in this, he maintained boundaries. We'll need to make our first public appearance tomorrow night. The mayor's charity gala. I turned to face him, my husband of 6 hours. What exactly do you expect from me at these events? His dark eyes studied me with the intensity of a predator calculating distance. Smile. Look devoted. Let me handle the conversations. He straightened his already perfect cufflinks. And Teresa? We're married now. Act like it. The door closed with a soft click, leaving me alone in my beautiful cage. The next evening, I stood before a mirror wearing another borrowed dress, this time black silk that cost more than my car, watching James adjust his bow tie behind me. His reflection met mine in the glass, and something electric passed between us before I looked away. Remember, he murmured, close enough that his breath warmed my neck, you belong to me tonight. Everyone needs to believe it. The gala was everything I'd expected. Crystal chandeliers, champagne towers, politicians in $1,000 tuxedos discussing million-dollar deals. I floated beside James like an expensive accessory, his hand possessively placed at the small of my back. James, you've been keeping secrets, Mayor Davidson approached with his wife, both scanning me like I was livestock at auction. You didn't mention you'd married. James's hand tightened against my spine. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Gentlemen, I'd like you to meet my wife. The way he said it, my wife, sent something dark and unwelcome spiraling through my chest. Not affection. Possession. Complete, unquestioning ownership. His tone suggested I was property he'd acquired, territory he'd claimed, a prize he'd won through negotiation rather than love. Mrs. Davidson smiled with practiced warmth. How wonderful. How long have you two been together? I opened my mouth to respond, but James's thumb pressed against my back, a warning. Long enough to know she's exactly what I need, he answered, his gaze never leaving the mayor's face. Teresa understands the importance of loyalty. Don't you, Cara? The Italian endearment felt like silk wrapped around a blade. I smiled, playing my part perfectly. Of course. But inside, something rebelled against the casual way he'd reduced our arrangement to ownership. This was business, I reminded myself. Nothing more. Even if his hand on my skin felt like it might burn straight through the contract we'd signed. The restaurant hummed with the kind of quiet wealth that whispered rather than shouted. Crystal stemware caught candlelight across white tablecloths while servers moved like shadows between tables of men who controlled half the city's economy. I sat beside James, my hand resting on his arm as we'd practiced, playing the devoted wife while he conducted business over $20 appetizers. Garcia, you've surprised us all. Vincent Torino leaned back in his chair, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. Across from him, his associate Carlo Benedetti watched me with eyes that made my skin crawl. Marriage wasn't something we expected from you. Especially not to someone so. He let the word hang in the air like smoke from expensive cigars. So what? James's voice remained level, but I felt the tension coiling in his muscles beneath my fingers. Young. Inexperienced. Torino's gaze traveled over me slowly, deliberately. Pretty little architects don't usually understand the complexities of our world. Do you, sweetheart? The condescension dripped from his words like honey laced with poison. He was testing us both, James's commitment to me, my loyalty to James. I felt like prey caught between predators. I understand enough, I replied carefully, keeping my voice steady despite the way my pulse hammered against my throat. Benedetti chuckled, the sound oily and unpleasant. She's got spirit. But spirit doesn't mean discretion. How do we know your little bride won't run to the papers the first time things get complicated? James's fork paused halfway to his mouth. When he set it down, the soft clink against porcelain somehow sounded like a gunshot. What exactly are you suggesting, Carlo? The temperature at our table dropped 10 degrees. Benedetti either didn't notice or didn't care. I'm suggesting that marriage makes men sentimental. Weak. And weakness in our business gets people killed. He leaned forward, his smile predatory. Maybe your wife needs to understand what she's really signed up for. What happens to people who can't keep their mouths shut? James moved faster than I'd thought possible. His hand shot across the table, grabbing Benedetti's wrist with enough force that I heard bones creak. The man's face went white, then red, as James's grip tightened. Let me be very clear, James's voice was silk over steel, quiet enough that nearby diners couldn't hear but deadly enough to stop my heart. My wife is off limits. Her reputation is off limits. Any suggestion otherwise will be taken as a direct insult to me personally. Benedetti tried to pull away, but James held firm. The other man's breathing became shallow, strained. Do you understand me, Carlo? Jesus, James, let go. Do you understand me? Yes. Yes, I understand. James released him with the casual indifference of someone discarding trash. Benedetti cradled his wrist, his face a mask of humiliation and barely contained rage. Excellent. James straightened his cufflinks, his demeanor shifting back to perfect calm as if nothing had happened. Gentlemen, I believe we're finished here. As we left the restaurant, James's hand returned to its familiar place at the small of my back. But this time it didn't feel like possession. It felt like protection. A shield between me and men who would destroy me without a second thought. That was, I started. Necessary, he finished, his dark eyes scanning the street as his driver approached. You're under my protection now, Teresa. That means something. For the first time since signing that contract, I believed him. The charity luncheon at the Metropolitan Club felt like stepping into old money's living room. Mahogany paneling climbed toward coffered ceilings while afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows, casting jeweled patterns across Persian rugs that probably predated the building itself. James moved through the crowd like he owned every conversation, every handshake, every carefully modulated laugh. Mrs. Garcia, a woman approached with the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. I don't believe we've met. Diana Hawthorne, City Planning Commission. I accepted her handshake, noting the way her fingers lingered just a moment too long. Everything about her was perfectly calculated, blonde hair swept into a chignon that probably required an hour with a stylist, pearls that caught the light just so, a navy dress that screamed understated wealth. Teresa, I replied, letting James's surname settle uncomfortably on my tongue. It's lovely to meet you. Your husband speaks very highly of your architectural work, Diana continued, her tone carrying just enough warmth to seem genuine. I imagine the transition from designing buildings to this lifestyle must be quite dramatic. There was something in the way she said it, a subtle emphasis that made my skin prickle with unease. As if she knew more about my life than a stranger should. Every transition has its challenges, I answered carefully. Of course. Her smile widened. Though I'm sure someone with your background handles pressure well. After all, architectural deadlines can be so demanding. Especially when you're working with difficult clients. The words felt loaded with meaning I couldn't quite grasp. Before I could respond, James appeared at my side, his hand sliding possessively around my waist. Diana, he acknowledged with polite coolness. I hope you're not monopolizing my wife's time. Not at all. We were just discussing the pressures of professional life. Diana's gaze flicked between us, something calculating in her expression. I was telling Teresa how much I admire people who can reinvent themselves completely. Start fresh. Leave the past behind. Again, that subtle emphasis. That knowing look. James's fingers tightened against my hip. The past is rarely as interesting as people believe. Perhaps. Diana smiled one final time before melting back into the crowd. It was lovely meeting you, Teresa. I'm sure we'll see each other again soon. Hours later, back in the penthouse, I sat at my laptop reviewing emails from my barely surviving firm when a new message appeared in my inbox. No sender name. Subject line, remember? My cursor hovered over it for a long moment before I clicked. The image loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, until I was staring at a photograph I hadn't seen in 3 years. Me, younger, thinner, standing beside Marcus Thorne outside my old apartment building. His arm was wrapped around my waist possessively, pulling me close enough that I looked uncomfortable even in the still image. My smile was strained, my body language screaming tension despite the way he held me like a prize he'd won. Below the photo, a single line of text, some contracts are harder to break than others. My hand shook as I closed the laptop, my heart hammering against my ribs. Someone knew about Marcus. Someone had been watching me long enough to have photographs from my past. Someone was sending me a message. The penthouse suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trap, its floor-to-ceiling windows exposing me to unseen eyes. James was in his office, door closed, conducting business I wasn't supposed to understand. But I was beginning to realize that in his world, the past never stayed buried for long. The dining room felt less imposing at night, shadows softening the sharp edges of crystal and silver. James sat across from me at the mahogany table that could seat 12. Both of us occupying opposite ends like strangers sharing space in an expensive hotel. The staff had served dinner, something French with a name I couldn't pronounce, before disappearing into whatever hidden corners of the penthouse they occupied. You've been quiet today, James observed, cutting his steak with surgical precision. The luncheon went well, I thought. I pushed food around my plate, the photograph from the anonymous email burning behind my eyes like an afterimage. That woman, Diana. She seemed to know things about me. James paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. What kind of things? Nothing specific. Just, the way she spoke. Like she'd done research. I set down my utensils, appetite gone. James, I need to tell you something. About my past. He studied me across the candlelit distance, dark eyes unreadable. I'm listening. The words came slowly, painfully, like removing splinters from an old wound. I was involved with someone before. Marcus Thorne. For 2 years. He was. I searched for the right words. Controlling doesn't cover it. Possessive. He monitored my phone calls, my emails. Showed up at my office unannounced. Made scenes when other men so much as looked at me. James's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I finally left him 3 years ago, but it wasn't easy. He followed me for months. Sent flowers to my apartment. Called my clients, trying to sabotage my work. My hands trembled as I reached for my wine glass. He saw me as something he owned. A possession to be controlled. The silence stretched between us like a wire pulled taut. When James finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority I'd learned to recognize. Where is he now? I don't know. I changed my number, moved apartments twice. I thought. I laughed bitterly. I thought I was free of him. James set down his napkin with deliberate care and moved to the chair beside mine, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and dark that made my pulse quicken despite everything. Teresa. He turned toward me, his full attention focused like a laser. You're under my protection now. That means something. Marcus Thorne, or anyone else from your past, cannot touch you while you're my wife. The way he said my wife again, but this time it didn't sound like possession. It sounded like a promise. You don't understand, I whispered. Marcus isn't the kind of man who accepts defeat. If he finds out about us, about this arrangement, let him try. James's hand covered mine, warm and steady. I've dealt with men like him before. They're cowards who prey on women they think are unprotected. His thumb traced across my knuckles, and something shifted between us in the candlelit darkness. You're not unprotected anymore. The ballroom at the Fairmont shimmered like something out of a fever dream. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors where the city's elite moved in careful choreography, their conversations worth millions, their smiles worth even more. My burgundy gown, another borrowed piece from James's stylist, swept around my ankles as he led me onto the dance floor. You look beautiful tonight, he murmured against my ear, his hand settling at my waist with practiced ease. The compliment shouldn't have made my pulse quicken, but it did. Part of the performance, I replied, though my voice came out breathier than intended. Is it? His dark eyes searched mine as we moved to the orchestra's languid rhythm. Around us, other couples swayed in perfect time, but I felt isolated in our small circle of space, hyper-aware of every point where his body touched mine. The music shifted, and James pulled me closer. I could feel the warmth of his chest through the fine fabric of his tuxedo, smell the subtle cologne that had become familiar over these weeks of careful distance. His thumb traced along my spine, sending electricity shooting through my nervous system. Mrs. Garcia, a voice interrupted our careful bubble. Senator Harrison appeared beside us, his smile predatory and his eyes already glassy from too much champagne. May I cut in? James's grip tightened almost imperceptibly. I don't think. Of course, I said quickly, recognizing the political necessity. James reluctantly stepped back, his jaw set in a hard line as Harrison's sweaty palm replaced his. The senator's hands immediately wandered lower than appropriate, his breath reeking of alcohol as he leaned too close. You know, darling, Garcia's not the only man with influence in this city. A beautiful woman like you shouldn't limit her options. Senator, I think you've misunderstood. Have I? His grip became painful, fingers digging into my lower back. Smart girls know how to diversify their investments. Garcia's got enemies, sweetheart. Dangerous ones. Wouldn't want you getting caught in the crossfire. Before I could respond, Harrison was suddenly gone, yanked backward with enough force that he stumbled into other dancers. James stood where the senator had been, his face a mask of controlled fury that made my blood run cold. Touch my wife again, he said quietly, his voice carrying despite the music, and I'll break every bone in your hand. Harrison opened his mouth to protest, but James was already pulling me against him with desperate intensity. His hand fisted in my hair, tilting my face up to his, and then his mouth was on mine with a hunger that obliterated every careful boundary we'd maintained. The kiss was devastating. Raw. Possessive in a way that had nothing to do with contracts or political theater. His lips moved against mine like he was claiming something that belonged to him, like he was marking territory. I melted into him completely, my hands fisting in his lapels, every nerve ending alive with want. Around us, conversations died. The careful social machinery of the ballroom ground to a halt as the city's most eligible bachelor devoured his mysterious wife in front of 300 witnesses. When we broke apart, both breathing hard, the damage was already done. The photograph appeared in the society pages the next morning, James and me locked in that devastating kiss, my burgundy dress a splash of color against his black tuxedo, our faces illuminated by chandelier light. The caption read, "Power couple James Garcia and wife Teresa share a passionate moment at last night's Children's Hospital fundraiser." I stared at the image over my coffee, remembering the way his mouth had felt against mine, the desperate hunger in his touch. The way every careful boundary we'd built had shattered in that single moment. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. Saw the picture, baby. You look good. Real good. The coffee cup slipped from my hands, ceramic shattering against the marble floor as Marcus's voice echoed from my past like a ghost given form. I hadn't heard that voice in 3 years, but it still made my skin crawl with remembered fear. "Miss the way you used to look at me like that. We need to talk." I deleted the message with shaking fingers, but another appeared immediately. "Don't ignore me, Teresa. You know how that makes me angry." By noon, I couldn't focus on the blueprints spread across my desk at the small office I still maintained downtown. Every shadow outside the window looked like Marcus. Every footstep in the hallway made my pulse race. When my assistant knocked, I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Mrs. Garcia? There's a gentleman here to see you. Says it's personal." My blood turned to ice. "What's his name?" "Marcus Thorne. He says you're expecting him." The world tilted sideways. He'd found me. After 3 years of careful hiding, one society photograph had led him straight to my door. "Tell him I'm not available," I managed. But it was too late. Marcus pushed past my assistant like she was made of tissue paper, filling my office doorway with the same overwhelming presence that had once made me feel so small. He looked older, harder, his dark hair streaked with premature silver and his eyes carrying a manic intensity that made my stomach clench with fear. "Hello, beautiful," he said, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounded like a trap snapping shut. "Miss me?" Before I could answer, before I could even process the nightmare of seeing him again, my office door exploded open. 2 men in expensive suits moved like predators, flanking Marcus before he could react. Behind them, James appeared in the doorway, his presence filling the space with cold, lethal authority. "Mr. Thorne," James's voice was silk over steel, calm and conversational. "You seem to have lost your way." Marcus spun around, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, then fury. "Garcia. I should have known. You always did like collecting other men's leftovers." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. James stepped forward with the fluid grace of a man comfortable with violence, his dark eyes fixed on Marcus like a predator sizing up prey. "Let me be very clear about something, Marcus. Teresa belongs to me now. Touch her, approach her, even think about her, and I will personally ensure you disappear." His voice never rose above a conversational tone, but something in it made Marcus take a step backward. The penthouse felt cavernous without James's presence, every shadow seeming to harbor threats I couldn't name. He'd left that morning for Chicago, business that required his personal attention, he'd said, his jaw tight with frustration at the timing. The kiss from 2 nights ago hung between us like a live wire, unacknowledged but impossible to ignore. "I'll be back tomorrow night," he'd promised, his hand lingering on my face in a gesture that felt more intimate than our contract allowed. "Don't leave the building. Now, 12 hours later, I understood why. My phone buzzed against the marble kitchen counter, another unknown number lighting up the screen. Beautiful view from up here. Your husband has expensive taste. My blood turned to ice. I moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows, scanning the building across the street, the rooftops, anywhere Marcus might be watching. The city sprawled below like a glittering web, and somewhere in it, he was hunting me. Another message: remember our first night together? You wore that little blue dress. Looked so nervous, so sweet. I miss that version of you. The phone slipped from my trembling hands, clattering across the marble. Marcus wasn't just watching, he was remembering. Cataloging moments from our past like a collector organizing trophies. The blue dress he mentioned, I'd thrown it away years ago, unable to bear the memories it carried. Garcia's not here to protect you now. We both know you belong with me. I called James immediately, my fingers fumbling with the number. It went straight to voicemail. His phone was off, probably in some high-stakes meeting where interruptions meant millions lost. The sound of his recorded voice, calm and authoritative, almost made me break down completely. James, it's me. Marcus is, he's watching the building. He knows you're gone. I don't know what to do. Hours crawled by like wounded animals. I found myself checking the locks on doors that hadn't been opened in months, jumping at every sound from the hallway. The penthouse's security system felt inadequate against the kind of obsession Marcus wielded like a weapon. As darkness fell over the city, another message arrived: I'm coming up, baby. Time to come home. That's when it hit me, the realization that crashed over me like a wave, stealing my breath and leaving me gasping. Somewhere between the contract signing and tonight's terror, I'd fallen in love with James Garcia. Not the public figure, not the powerful man who commanded rooms with a look, but the man who defended me against senators, who promised protection with deadly sincerity, who kissed me like I was oxygen and he was drowning. I loved him, and he wasn't here. The elevator dinged in the distance, and my heart stopped completely. Marcus had found a way up. The security James had promised, the fortress he'd built around me, meant nothing against a man who'd spent 3 years planning his approach. Footsteps echoed down the marble hallway, measured and familiar, growing closer with each passing second. I pressed myself against the kitchen island, phone clutched in my hand like a lifeline, and waited for my past to finally catch up with me. The charity dinner at the Four Seasons was supposed to be routine, another evening of carefully orchestrated smiles and political theater. James had returned from Chicago that afternoon, his relief at finding me safe palpable in the way his hands had framed my face, checking for damage that existed only in his imagination. We hadn't spoken about the messages, about Marcus's threats, but his security detail had tripled overnight. Stay close tonight, he'd murmured as we entered the hotel's grand ballroom, his hand possessive at the small of my back. Something feels off. The evening progressed normally at first. Champagne flutes caught crystal light from massive chandeliers while the city's elite mingled over 7-course dinners and silent auction paddles. I wore emerald green silk that made James's eyes darken with something that had nothing to do with our contract, and for brief moments, I could almost forget we were playing roles. James was deep in conversation with the mayor about waterfront development when the lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then the emergency exits burst open simultaneously. Marcus strode through the main entrance like he owned the room, his expensive suit doing nothing to mask the manic energy radiating from him in waves. Security moved to intercept, but he raised his right hand, and the glint of gunmetal stopped them cold. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Screams pierced the air as 300 guests scrambled for exits that were suddenly blocked by men in dark suits, Marcus's men, I realized with growing horror. He'd planned this. Orchestrated it down to the last detail. Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus's voice carried across the marble space with theatrical grandeur, I apologize for the interruption. I'm here for my wife. James moved in front of me with fluid precision, his body becoming a shield between Marcus and me. Every muscle in his frame was coiled for violence, but the gun in Marcus's hand kept him frozen 3 feet away. Teresa, Marcus continued, his eyes finding mine across the chaos, you look radiant. Marriage agrees with you. Too bad it's built on lies. Let them go, James's voice cut through the noise like a blade. This is between you and me. Is it? Marcus laughed, the sound sharp and unhinged. See, that's where you're wrong, Garcia. This is about property. About ownership. About a man taking back what belongs to him. The gun swung toward James, and my world narrowed to that single point of deadly metal. Around us, guests pressed against the walls, their faces white with terror. Camera phones captured everything despite the danger. This would be front-page news by morning. You want to know the beautiful part? Marcus continued, his finger caressing the trigger. Your precious marriage is a fraud. A business arrangement. She signed a contract to be your wife for 1 year, nothing more. How does it feel to know your great love story is just another transaction? Gasps rippled through the crowd. James's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly, but he didn't turn around, didn't take his eyes off the gun pointed at his chest. Teresa, Marcus called, his voice dropping to that intimate tone that used to make my skin crawl. Come here. We're leaving. You can walk out with me willingly, or I can put a bullet in your fake husband and drag you out over his body. Your choice. Without thinking, without calculating consequences or considering survival, I stepped around James. His hand shot out to stop me, but I was already moving, placing myself between the gun and the man I loved. No, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. If you want to hurt him, you'll have to go through me first. Marcus's face contorted with rage. You stupid little. She's not going anywhere. James's voice behind me was death itself, cold and final. I felt rather than saw him move, positioning himself so that any shot Marcus took would have to go through both of us. You want to destroy my empire? James continued, his tone conversational despite the gun trained on us. Expose the contract? Do it. None of it matters if she's not safe. Marcus's hand shook now, the gun wavering between us as his carefully constructed plan began to unravel. He'd expected James to choose his reputation, his power, his carefully built empire over one woman. Instead, James had chosen me. 3 years I spent tracking her down, Marcus snarled. 3 years planning this moment. She belongs to me. No, James said quietly, and I felt his hand settle on my shoulder with infinite gentleness. She belongs to herself. She always has. The ballroom held its collective breath. In the distance, sirens wailed through Manhattan traffic. Someone had gotten through to the police despite Marcus's planning. Choose, Teresa, Marcus demanded, desperation creeping into his voice. Him or me? Your fake marriage or the real thing we had? I looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and saw him clearly for the first time. Not the charming man who'd swept me off my feet 5 years ago, but the obsessed stranger who'd turned love into ownership, devotion into possession. I already chose, I said, reaching back to take James's hand. I chose him. The gunshot never came. James moved faster than physics should have allowed, his body a blur of controlled violence as he lunged forward. The gun went flying across marble floors as both men crashed into a table laden with crystal that shattered like frozen tears. Marcus fought like a cornered animal, all desperation and fury, but James was precision incarnate, every movement calculated to end the threat without mercy. When it was over, Marcus lay unconscious on the ballroom floor, his expensive suit torn and bloodied, James's knee pressed against his spine while security rushed to apply restraints. The sirens outside grew louder, closer, and I realized I was shaking so violently I could barely stand. Get him out of here, James commanded, his voice hoarse from exertion. And make sure the press understands that anyone who publishes photos from tonight will find their publications shut down permanently. The cleanup happened with military efficiency. Guests were escorted out through private exits, their phones confiscated until legal agreements were signed. Marcus disappeared into police custody while lawyers materialized from thin air to handle the aftermath. Through it all, James remained in control, orchestrating damage control with the same ruthless precision he brought to every aspect of his life. But his hands shook when he thought no one was looking. Hours later, we sat in his penthouse office, the city sprawling below us like scattered diamonds. The contracts and legal documents that usually covered his desk had been swept aside, replaced by untouched glasses of brandy and the weight of everything that had changed in a single evening. "The story will be contained," James said finally, his voice carrying exhaustion like a physical weight. "Marcus won't be getting out anytime soon. Assault, terrorist threats, weapons charges, he's finished." I nodded, though my mind felt wrapped in cotton. The emerald dress I'd worn to dinner was torn at the shoulder, a reminder of how close we'd come to losing everything. "James," I began, then stopped, the words tangling in my throat like barbed wire. He looked up at me from behind his desk, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked vulnerable. Human. The mask of controlled authority had slipped, revealing something raw underneath. "You could have been killed tonight," I whispered. "Because of me. Because of my past, my mistakes." "Stop." He stood abruptly, moving around the desk to kneel beside my chair. His hands covered mine, warm and steady despite everything. "None of this was your fault. Marcus is sick, obsessed. You didn't create that. But I brought it into your life. Into your world." Tears I'd been holding back for hours finally spilled over. "I watched him point that gun at you and I realized." My voice broke completely. "What?" James prompted gently, his thumbs brushing tears from my cheeks with infinite tenderness. "I realized I love you." The confession tore from my throat like a physical thing. "Not the contract, not the arrangement, not what you can provide. You. The man who defends senators' wives from predators. Who promises protection and means it. Who stepped in front of a gun tonight without hesitation." James went very still, his dark eyes searching mine with desperate intensity. "I love you," I repeated, my voice stronger now, "and the thought of losing you terrifies me more than anything Marcus could have done." For a long moment, the only sound was our breathing and the distant hum of the city below. Then James cupped my face in his hands with the reverence of a man handling something precious beyond measure. "Teresa," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I fell in love with you the night you signed those papers. You sat in that chair wearing that blue dress, terrified but determined, and I knew I was in trouble." My heart stopped completely. "Every day since has been torture," he continued. "Wanting you, needing you, but bound by contracts and agreements and the fear that you'd leave the moment you could. Tonight, when I saw that gun pointed at you," his voice cracked. "I would have burned my entire empire to keep you safe." "James." He stood suddenly, moving to the wall safe hidden behind a Picasso original. His fingers worked the combination with practiced ease before withdrawing a familiar folder, our marriage contract, the document that had bound us together in legal fiction. He carried it back to where I sat, then knelt again, placing the papers in my hands. "Burn it," he said simply. I stared at the contract, at the signatures and clauses that had brought us together, that had given me sanctuary and him companionship. "James, what are you?" "Burn it," he repeated, his eyes never leaving mine. "We don't need contracts anymore. We don't need agreements or terms or exit clauses. We're married, Teresa. For real. For love. For whatever comes next." My hands trembled as I held the papers that had once defined our entire relationship. All those careful boundaries, all those protection clauses, all those guarantees of eventual freedom, reduced to mere paper in the face of what we'd discovered tonight. "Are you sure?" I whispered. James smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him all evening. It transformed his entire face, making him look younger, freer, like a man who'd finally stopped fighting a war he'd never wanted to win. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." I walked to the fireplace, James following close behind. The flames danced like tiny celebrations as I held our contract over them, watching months of careful legal language catch fire and curl into ash. When it was gone, James pulled me into his arms and kissed me with the desperate hunger of a man who no longer had to hold back. This time, there were no contracts between us. No agreements or terms or careful boundaries. Just love, real and raw and ours.